This is Women Road Warriors with Shelley Johnson and Kathy Tuccaro. From the corporate office to the cab of a truck, they're here to inspire and empower women in all professions. So gear down, sit back, and enjoy.
Welcome. We're an award-winning show dedicated to empowering women in every profession through inspiring stories and expert insights. No topic is off limits on our show. We power women on the road to success with expert and celebrity interviews and information you need. I'm Shelley, and Kathy's on assignment. Too many people have been persecuted for their beliefs or the way they are. They've been cast out and labeled. Some have even been convicted and executed. The 1692 Salem Witch trials are examples of this. It was a dark time in U.S. history, and it illustrates how society can marginalize people in brutal ways and punish them just because they're different. The last woman to be convicted in Salem was 22-year-old Elizabeth Johnson, Jr. She was called a detestable witch and sentenced to hang. She was not executed as many of the others, but her conviction followed her for the rest of her life. She was forever labeled, and the last person to be cleared of the terrible charges. Elizabeth was not exonerated until 330 years later due to the work of a school project in an 8th grade civics class in Massachusetts. They got her cleared by the state legislature. Los Angeles-based filmmaker Annika Hylmö wants Elizabeth's story told. She's the producer of a documentary called The Last Witch. The Last Witch shows how a schoolteacher, her students, and their allies not only set Elizabeth's wrongful conviction right, but that by making amends with the past, they provide all of us with inspiration to create a better future. The Last Witch draws attention to our own individual responsibility to look at how we treat others and reduce bullying and marginalization everywhere, because it still exists. I have Annika with me today to talk about what people can learn from her documentary. Welcome, Annika. Thank you for being on the show.
Hi, Shelley. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And I'm really honored to have you on the show. This is an incredible project you decided to take on. As I was saying to you before we started the interview, I remember running across the story of Elizabeth. That was really a dark period in our country. And people were labeled just because they were different. And I find it incredible that it's taken 330 years for her story to be told and for her to finally have her name cleared.
It's pretty remarkable. It was a dark period in history, not just here, but around the world, and especially for women who were marginalized at the time. Elizabeth was forgotten for all that time. It was only just rediscovered, I think, about 10, 15 years ago now, when the author Richard Haidt wrote a book about North Andover, which is outside of Salem. And he discovered that there were more people that were accused in the city of Salem. He discovered that there were more people were accused in North Andover than anywhere else in Essex County, which is now where Salem resides. So he, in his research, discovered that Elizabeth was still not cleared of her crime as a witch. And if you go back in 1692, that was a capital offense. So this is the worst of the worst that you could think of. This was akin to, I don't know, a pedophile today, perhaps even worse. And she lived for the rest of her life with that conviction hanging over her head, not knowing exactly what was going to happen, if this was going to flare up again. It died down, but she lived with a conviction. And then it took all the while until July 28th, 2022, for the governor of Massachusetts to sign the budget with an attached amendment that would say that Elizabeth was cleared of her crime forever. That's remarkable.
Oh, and such a delay. We've looked back at history and thought the Salem witch trials were absolutely ridiculous and inhumane. We've looked back at history and thought the Salem witch trials were absolutely ridiculous and inhumane. Why would it take so long for her name to be cleared? Because these people weren't witches. Why were they persecuted? Why were they put on trial for being a witch?
Well, I think there are lots of questions in there that are really important to think about, because if we look around, we can see much of it be reflected today. And that's what drew me to this story. It was a perfect storm in many ways at the time. Massachusetts was, at the time, their charter had been withdrawn. So it was pretty lawless at the time. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody knew exactly what the rules were. And it was at a time when we're talking about third generation immigrants in some cases. It wasn't not just first generation. This was a couple of generations gone, and people were trying to figure out who's who in this community. And you saw a time when it was too hot in the summers, too cold in the winters. People hadn't quite figured out how to deal with that. So not enough food. You had wars going on in the world and to the north. And so people felt very threatened during this time. They'd also just experienced a bout of smallpox. And so you would have people that were harmed or maimed by that disease, having marks left after that disease, and a number of people that, of course, had died from it. So it was a time with a lot of uncertainty and a time when different religions were starting to come to town. So just in general, an era where people were confused about many things, and they didn't have the same kinds of explanations that we think that we do today to some natural causes. So when the Salem witch trials started, it was really because a couple of young girls threw some fits, and this is the very simple version of it. They threw some fits, and nobody really knew what had happened to them. Nobody knew why. So they brought people in, including, I believe they brought in the local would-be doctor, who they didn't have doctors the way that we've got doctors today, but who said, I have no idea what's going on. It must be witchcraft. There's also a story about a slave woman. Her name was Tituba, and she was using an anti-witch spell. And now this is important because there were both people who were believing in folk magic and in the dark magic that had to do with the devil. And Tituba tried to use an antidote against the darkness of the devil to try to clear these young girls of their ailments, and it didn't work. And when that didn't work, everyone assumed that it had to be witchcraft because nothing else seemed to work. And I think that speaks a lot to the desperation that we can get to when we can't explain things, when we feel like things are out of control, that we have no control over the situation.
Oh, yeah. Well, we witnessed some of that during the pandemic. When you think about it, lots of fear, lots of finger pointing, condemnation on both sides. I mean, it was really kind of crazy to observe human beings.
Absolutely. And I think we're seeing it all around now, too.
Mm-hmm.
Look around the political climate right now. One of the things that I'm hoping that this documentary can lead to is some conversations instead of the finger pointing, because that's not getting us anywhere.
No.
And it's interesting because we haven't learned that. We've seen that so many times that finger pointing doesn't work. So why do we keep doing it?
Human beings like to condemn. I don't know if this is a natural state of humanity. I would like to think we're better than that. But when you think about it, growing up, kids tease. Kids are terrible bullies. They really can be that way. You see it on social media. And what was going on with the Salem witch trials was just another form of bullying. You had a group of people that could be scapegoated, if you will, blamed. You had a lot of people who were uneducated. They were superstitious. They had to find blame, attach the blame to something. Like you were saying, there were epidemics going on. They didn't understand. So they could find a group of people. Maybe this was a way to assuage the hungry crowd and mob. I mean, it was a sick way of doing things, but unfortunately, that has been human history.
Absolutely, it has been. And it's going on today as well. I mean, look at some of the top shows on TV are these quote unquote reality documentaries about murders and mayhem. And and that's not too different from when we look back at what was going on back then. Just like today, people will go to the movie theater, they'll get a bucket of popcorn and they'll watch a horror movie. And back then, they would do something very similar, only they would be watching their neighbors be tried for witchcraft. And we're not that different. That's the thing. We're not that different from 1692. We're interviewing middle school kids in here because it was their project, a middle school class of civics students. And they had to take this project because every middle school in Massachusetts, every middle schooler has to take a civics class because their government, wisely enough, realized that kids were growing up not knowing the difference between real news and fake news. And they didn't know how government works. And if you don't know how government works and you don't know how to discern between fake and real news, you can't really participate in a democracy.
True.
So the wise men and women of Massachusetts, the Senate and the government, they decided that let's do something about that. Let's give these kids the opportunity to take on a civics project. And it has to be an applied civics project where they have to come up with arguments and try to change something that they think isn't working. And for these kids, it was the case of Elizabeth Johnson Jr., who was that last non-convicted, convicted, but not exonerated a person from the Salem witch trials. But in there, in interviewing these kids, one of the things that they really draw a correlation with between it's themselves and the experience that Elizabeth had at the time, because she was bullied. We've got the court documents from the time. They're not all there, but most of them are there. And we can see just how bullied people were into confessing and the spectacle around it. And that's something that middle school kids can relate to because they deal with it every day. But then we take that a step further and we look at adults and we look at all the bullying that's going on amongst adults. And we go, can we ever learn?
Wouldn't it be nice?
That's the question.
Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if we could? I remember growing up in elementary school and even junior high, the kids were mean. I have red hair. I was always singled out. And children, for something, I don't know if it's jealousy or if it's just because you're different. If you're different, you're a target. And I see the Salem witch trials as nothing different than that. And of course, we've got a history, all societies do, unfortunately, of persecution. Someone's different, we're going to ostracize them. Someone's different, we're going to condemn them. We're going to label them. And it's so wrong. I mean, it's marginalization.
Exactly. And the kind of marginalization that you see from the Salem witch trials, it ranged from somebody who was a little bit different. We can't say for sure about Elizabeth because we cannot, I have to emphasize that we cannot diagnose somebody retroactively after 300 years to say that they were, I don't know if they were developmentally different. I guess that goes as far as they generally talk about it. But was she, did she have autism, for example, or was there another problem that she was dealing with? But what we can do is we can look at all of these court documents and see, first of all, Elizabeth was listed or named as being simplish at best. And that gives us a clue that her grandfather thought that she was simple compared to other people. And maybe a judgment call.
Simple being mentally challenged or something? I mean, was that?
Well, that's what we can't say for sure. That there are people who will say that she was mentally challenged. And there are two documents that we've got that say that she was simplish or simple in some way. But again, what does that mean when we're talking about a 22-year-old girl? You know, we look around, there are 22-year-old girls that do silly things. I was probably one of them.
Oh, yeah. my hands up, definitely.
Right. Exactly. So I just want to be a little bit careful of labeling somebody that way. That being said, reading through all of these court documents, you do see signs of people having had nightmares, people talking of melancholy, people talking about having dealt with war. You can imagine the PTSD that some of these people would have been dealing with. We know that there were people who were elderly. We know of one woman who was deaf. We know of another woman who may have had Alzheimer's when we look at it. And when you're different in that way, or if you're economically disadvantaged in some way, or if you were a single mother, those are things that would put you in that category. Single mothers, or in Elizabeth's case, because she wasn't married, she didn't have any children. And that put her in a different category too. So if you're different, it's really easy to start pointing fingers. And then all of a sudden you find the reasons for why something is wrong. And you find these little signs and teeny tiny signs, and you get this mass psychology that starts to take off. where people start to accuse one another, and then people got afraid of being accused. They would accuse people before they would get accused themselves, and then they would accuse people to avoid execution. So it got to be very dark very quickly. We're talking about just the span of maybe 8-9 months when this was at its worst, at its height.
What started the Salem Witch trial? What started that whole series of trials? Was it a rumor? Were there a group of people that were singled out?
Well, it was those two girls, that first initial incident that happened, that they couldn't figure out what was going on with some of the kids that were throwing fits, that they were having fits. And we don't know to this day why they were having fits. But that's really what started it. The unawareness or lack of knowledge of what was going on when people got sick. And trying to find an explanation for that. And then that very quickly started to take off into storytelling that people started to build on the same story. So, for example, there's a story about a witch party that was going on sometime in April, which then got turned into something where everybody was traveling to meet with the devil or partying with the devil and signing their souls to the devil. And people got named as having participated in this particular witch party that grew by leaps and bounds as people started to talk about it. And so gradually it started to take off, but we don't know for sure exactly what it was that set it off beyond that particular incident. It's very hard to tell. We also know that there were sermons in church on Sundays where people were told to stay away from witches. And we know that there were people who were told that Satan was in town, and that sometimes that there was one devil, sometimes that there were multiple devils. And if you listen to enough of those stories, you're going to start to believe them. That happens. That's just general psychology.
Oh, it goes on today. I mean, you hear something that over and over and over and over and over, people start to believe it's fact.
Exactly. I mean, look at everything that's on the internet today. All of a sudden, something takes off, and everyone believes that, of course, that's the way that it is, even though we haven't got an ounce of proof or an ounce of truth that's circulating around there. We just take it for granted, and people more and more take it for granted and stop questioning. So I think that's one of the dangerous things that we're dealing with now, that we need to look back at Salem witch trials and say, what are we doing?
Yes. Well, there's definitely a lesson here. Now, how many people were actually prosecuted in the witch trials?
How many people were actually prosecuted? We don't have an exact number because we don't have an exact count of all of the court. We've lost some of the court documents along the way, I should say. Actually prosecuted, I believe there were maybe something like somewhere between 25 and 35, but I could be wrong on that number. I don't have it in front of me. The number of people that were executed were 22, I believe, plus a dog, if not two.
Plus a dog?
Yes, because a dog gave somebody an evil eye, and therefore it may have been in cahoots with the devil.
Oh my goodness.
That's how far these things go.
Wow.
Yes.
I had not heard about that. Wow, that's amazing.
Dogs are evil. I love dogs, but they're evil.
Okay. Well, apparently in the 1600s they thought that.
They thought that for sure. And today I hope we don't believe that, but that was the impression, that a dog had given somebody an evil eye, and I believe they shot the dog immediately.
Wow.
Yeah, it's incredible. Once things start to take off, stories start to take off, and you get that sense of, well, what's happening? I can't trust anybody. I can't even trust myself in this after a while. Then everything becomes scary.
I mean,
Plus,
massive paranoia.
Massive paranoia.
Yeah.
And then think about it, because something that stands out for me is that back in the day, they didn't have electricity. And you think about being in a world where there's absolutely no electricity. So the shadows are dancing around you. And then you think about these houses that had small windows, because large windows would let in too much cold during winter. And that was one of the ways that we keep it out. So Instead, you've got the flames from the fireplace and from the candles. And so it was dark indoors, dark outside and dark indoors. And shadows got to be scary. And you'd hear something creak somewhere, something crack somewhere. And all of a sudden, you start to tell yourself stories. And it takes off very, very quickly.
Sure, it would. Now, were they all women that were put on trial?
Actually, not.
Oh,
No, there
okay.
were several men who were put on trial as well. Two cases that stand out for me, there were a number of them, but two that stand out for me are Giles Corey, who was pressed to death, an elderly man who was in his upper 80s, and he was pressed to death. And a younger man, his name was Samuel Wardwell, who was the town's fortune teller. And he was somebody who was able to intuit how many kids somebody was supposed to have or when something was supposed to happen. So kind of like somebody going to a psychic today.
Sure.
And he was hanged because of that.
You said the first gentleman was pressed to death?
Yes.
They crushed him?
They crushed him.
Oh my gosh.
They crushed him. It took him
wow.
about 3 days to die. I mean, these are horrific stories when we really dig into it. These are not quick deaths. They're very dark deaths. It took people up to an hour to die because they would be suffocating slowly when they were hanging. It wasn't what you see in the Hollywood movies where it's a quick snap of the neck and you're gone. It took a long time for people to die.
Inhumane.
Completely inhumane.
Yes.
Completely. And that's something that we have to really, really pay attention to. It's what are we doing as human beings and where do we go too far?
I've always maintained that humans are barbaric. Animals aren't. Humans can be absolutely evil, you know?
Well, yeah, there's a movie that I really, really like about Jane Goodall. And it's called Jane. It's a National Geographic movie, and it's about her work in Africa with the chimpanzees. And so am I getting that right? Was she working with chimpanzees or gorillas?
They were gorillas, I think.
They were gorillas. Yes, no. So Jane Goodall's work with the gorillas. And she discovered that they, like us, we are not as kind to each other as we really would like for us to be. And it always stood out for me that we are more barbaric, like you said, than we would like to acknowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, in all of this, it gives me a lot of hope working on this project, because it's on the one hand, it's going through all of these horrific stories of people that were just, their fates are horrible, horrible, horrible. And many of them have been forgotten, like Elizabeth was forgotten, and even the people who were hanged. It's like we hear some of the stories and we know that there are many, many descendants who are discovering their heritage and discovering something about themselves through those stories. But they tend to be forgotten for many, many reasons. And in this, the forgetting is one thing. We like to forget things. We like to forget the past. And then we repeat history. We do it all over again. And we go, we're never going to forget the past. And then we forget the past. And then we do it all over again.
Right.
So, there's definitely that. And there's also in this forgetting, it's a lot of people, what we don't acknowledge enough, the families still live in the area. Some families have moved away, but there are families that live in the area. And there is generational pain and generational trauma that's been handed down since the 1600s. So I'm not surprised that they don't necessarily want to talk about it. So, a lot of, we do need to talk about it, but it does give me hope that here's this middle class that's able to step in and change history. They changed the law. They changed history.
That's amazing, this 8th grade class. How fortuitous, how ambitious. What a wonderful thing to do. And is this the first person to actually be exonerated from the Salem witch trials?
She's not the first person. Okay. She's the last person to be exonerated.
The last person. Okay.
The last person. She was the last one, and she was completely forgotten. The last group of people were exonerated on October 31, on Halloween, which wasn't exactly appropriate, in 2001. But Elizabeth was forgotten largely because she was a little bit different. And so that would be a reason for why people would forget her. But probably more importantly, because she wasn't married and because she didn't have kids, she had no one to really speak for her. And for most of the others, they did have somebody to speak up for them, somebody to stand up for them. And that makes a big difference.
She would have been thought less than too, not being married. She would have been a spinster at 22 and not having children. That would have been different. Children were something that was a woman's duty, especially back then. Yeah.
Yes, it was. But I also stop and think sometimes about how we are treating women like that today. Because history is interesting, but it's also, what does that mean today? Are we making sure that we're including people who are a little bit different in our conversations? Are we taking the time to go, you want to have a cup of coffee? Just want to make sure that you're okay, or I want to get to know you and I'm interested in what you have to say. Do we take the time to do that, or do we just stay in our lanes? I think that we need to really stop and go, what are we doing now? And looking at that, I mean, this year is a perfect year to be looking at it too. And I'm sure next year will as well. How are we talking about women in politics? How are we talking about women who have powerful jobs? How do we talk about different kinds of jobs? Women having different kinds of jobs. I mean, one of the things that I love about your podcast is that you're two women having incredible jobs, making a huge difference, having fun, and doing it in different ways.
Well, thank you. And we're trying to make an impact and empower other women.
Well,
It's so important. If we can inspire just one person, we're doing our job.
That's how I feel. If we can inspire other people to take a chance to be doing something that they're really excited about and be happy doing it, I think we've gone a long way. If we can inspire people to think a little bit differently, not to tell people, just like what they are talking about at the school, what to think, but how to think it, or just encourage people to think a little bit and just ask some questions every now and then, be curious. If we can do that, then we can come a long way.
I totally agree.
Stay tuned for more of Women Road Warriors coming up.
Dean Michael, the tax doctor here. I have one question for you. Do you want to stop worrying about the IRS? If the answer is yes, then look no further. I've been around for years. I've helped countless people across the country, and my success rate speaks for itself. So now you know where to find good, honest help with your tax problems. What are you waiting for? If you owe more than $10,000 to the IRS or haven't filed in years, call me now at 888-557-4020 or go to mytaxhelpmd.com for a free consultation and get your life back.
Industry movement Trucking Moves America Forward is telling the story of the industry. Our safety champions, the women of trucking, independent contractors, the next generation of truckers, and more. Help us promote the best of our industry. Share your story and what you love about trucking. Share images of a moment you're proud of. And join us on social media. Learn more at truckingmovesamerica.com.
Welcome back to Women Road Warriors with Shelley Johnson and Kathy Tuccaro.
If you're enjoying this informative episode of Women Road Warriors, I wanted to mention Kathy and I explore all kinds of topics that will power you on the road to success. We feature a lot of expert interviews. Plus, we feature celebrities and women who've been trailblazers. Please check out our podcast at womenroadwarriors.com and click on our episodes page. We're also available wherever you listen to podcasts, on all the major podcast channels like Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Amazon Music, Audible, you name it. Check us out and bookmark our podcast. Also, don't forget to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, YouTube, and other sites. And tell others about us. We want to help as many women as possible. 22-year-old Elizabeth Johnson Jr. was the last person convicted in the Salem Witch trials. Elizabeth did not fit in. She was considered odd and called simple. She was very likely disabled in some way. Society persecuted, labeled, and condemned her at trial as a detestable witch. She was sentenced to death. She was not executed, but the conviction never went away. She was labeled for life. Elizabeth was not exonerated until 330 years later, after an 8th grade civics class got her name cleared by the state legislature in Massachusetts. Annika Hylmö wants her story told. Annika is the producer of a documentary called The Last Witch. The Last Witch shows us how a schoolteacher, her students, and their allies not only set Elizabeth's wrongful conviction right, but that by making amends with the past, they give all of us the inspiration to create a better future that doesn't repeat this same kind of condemnation, which can still happen today. Annika wants people to think about how we're showing up in the world and how we can make changes to offer a more positive society free of condemnation and persecution. She wants us to think hard about what we're doing as human beings and when we go too far. Elizabeth, you've got quite the background as a filmmaker and documentarian. What got you interested in this project? You've worked on a lot of different things, and I kind of like to delve a little bit into the documentary and what the message is, the overall message you're trying to convey.
Of course. So the documentary, ultimately, this is a documentary about voice and claiming your voice, having lost your voice, claiming your voice, standing up for others, giving voice to others. So that's a very strong theme that I'm working with. The documentary came to me. It's quite fascinating when I look back at it. It came to me. It started with a conversation in a bathroom at Sundance Film Festival in 2020. This was right before the pandemic, and it was in the middle of the night. And, you know, there are lots of events and lots of parties, and I had to go to the restroom, as we sometimes do. And the faucets were malfunctioning in there. So I crack a joke just because that's who I am. And I say, oh, it's magic. They finally came on. And with that, a woman walks out of one of the stalls and says, oh, and I'm related to one of the witch hunters from the Salem Witch trials. That conversation led to a curiosity about the trials, the discovery that there are court documents that are available for anybody to read online, every single one of them from the trials. And as the pandemic hit, I started to want to write a narrative script. But then I came across this article about a middle school teacher and her students who were working to exonerate the last of the convicted persons from the Salem witch trials. And I thought, this has to be a documentary. It was just one of those moments where it's a moment in history that had the possibility of being changed. And you don't often come across stories like that. This one was so unique. So that spoke to me. And I was sure that somebody else would have picked it up because it was that special. Everybody knows about the Salem witch trials and the fact that somebody was convicted, that there was a convicted witch in Massachusetts on the books. It just really spoke to me. So I reached out to the middle school teacher and to the senator who she was working with at the time. So Diana DiZoglio was a Massachusetts state senator at the time. Now she is the state controller. But so we talked, and they told me, well, nobody else has picked up on this. They were surprised that I would even be that interested in it. But curiosity and conversations, and they said, sure, we'll be a part of this, starting out as a short documentary. But as the project took off, it started to grow and grow because of the research that I was doing and talking with the kids, and also discovering that it wasn't as easy as you would think that Elizabeth would be cleared. To me, it was a no-brainer that of course she would be cleared. Everybody has been cleared. But what happened was that the bill was put out to study, which basically means, as one of the students says, put out to purgatory, that it died.
Good way to describe it. Yeah.
It's a great way to describe it. So nothing was going to happen with this bill until the documentary came to town, as I like to say. So all of a sudden it got attention, and nobody wanted to be caught. That's, you know, with egg on their face or whatever you want to say, because it would be a little bit embarrassing if the documentary comes to town and says, oh, here's somebody that was clearly not guilty and we're refusing to exonerate her. A little bit facetious. But so the bill was resurrected, and eventually the only way that they could pass it quickly was to get it through as an amendment to the budget in Massachusetts. So they had to have a debate. And with that debate, everything took off again because news outlets around the world started to report on it, say, oh my gosh, here's this woman who was convicted, and now she's clear of witchcraft. Well, clear of the crime of witchcraft. If you really look at it, she wasn't at that time when they had the debate. It took another 2 months before she was actually exonerated. So now we're back to the whole idea of fake news and real news and the ability to discern which is which. So those events, plus then digging deeper into why we need to look at the Salem witch trials and the impact today, it just got me really curious. So it blew up into a much, much bigger documentary that we're still in production with, but are hoping to be able to finish next year for a 2026 release. We'll see if we can make that, but that's the goal.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Now, is it going to be a docudrama? How did you structure everything? Because I would imagine some of this is going to be hard to replicate.
Well, it is. Some of it's going to be hard to replicate. So it is, first of all, it's a ghost story. We're telling the story of Elizabeth, who really will not shut up until she gets her say. And she has her eye on several things. The fact that she was cleared, but there wasn't really a big celebration when she was cleared. So now she wants all of us to listen to her, and she won't give up until we're willing to listen to her about speaking up for each other and not marginalizing anybody. So structuring it, it's still a work in progress. We're in the middle of editing, starting by looking at the process that the entire case had to go through, and then looking at the history, looking at many of the interviews that we have with various people, including follow-ups with some of the students that were participating about some of the issues that this brings to light. So it's a big jigsaw puzzle to put it together. I liken it to writing an essay. You know, when you write an essay, you've got to have an outline, and then you move things around, and you've got to have your thesis statement and all those things. It's very similar in some ways to that, but it's a gigantic jigsaw puzzle that's being put together, that's still coming together. And then the goal is to not only film a little bit more in Massachusetts now at the end of September, but we're also going to film next year when we'll be filming the reenactments. And those, we are hopeful to be able to bring in some of the students who would like to join us and have them participate as extras when we film literally the court documents that are available verbatim. We won't be using English from that time period because it's a little difficult for us to understand and follow. So we'll modernize it a bit. Yes, it's very difficult. But that's the goal, to be able to recreate some of those court trials that Elizabeth had to endure, her experiences back then.
Wow. This is an amazing project. And I love the fact that this is going to give people a perspective on taking a step back and thinking about how they treat other people.
Very much.
Yeah, because that really is, when you look at that whole time, it was nothing short of, it was persecution, plain and simple. Discrimination, persecution, everything that's just the most hateful part of society. And these women and men, and even a dog, were put in a corner and basically accused because people couldn't deal with whatever they were afraid of.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's really the lesson that we have to take away from this, is how easy it is to fall into the trap of persecution. And how easy it is to fall into the trap of bullying and speaking ill of another person without really knowing what we're talking about. And even if we know what we're talking about, how we choose our words, the idea of respect sometimes gets lost. If we can be respectful and appreciative and really enjoy the fact that sometimes we do have different perspectives on things, and be curious about that. I keep coming back to that curiosity and having conversations. I'd like to inspire people to have much more of that. You know, if we're able to do that over a cup of coffee, or if we do that just on a picnic by the beach or wherever in the forest, whatever you do, whatever you like to do, or if you're at the gym, talk to the person that's next to you and not shut somebody off just because they happen to look a little different, or because they might have some views that might be slightly different from yours, or come from a different background, but instead be curious about it. Go a long way.
That's what our country's supposed to be about. Have an open conversation. We have freedom of speech, and we're supposed to be created equal. I mean, that's what the Constitution, that's the Declaration of Independence, all of that. We're supposed to be equal. So we shouldn't be marginalizing other people, but of course people do that. And we have freedom of speech, so we should be able to have a conversation without pointing fingers, without getting violent, without doing the sort of thing that, frankly, the Salem witch trials, they're examples of that kind of thing going on in the world today. It's just different, but it's the same thing. So I really feel that your documentary is really timely in the message
Thank
that
you.
and people can walk out of the theater or wherever they watch it and think, this makes sense. This is very pertinent. This is very relevant to today.
Well, I think we're going to get there. We've got kids that are saying things that kids will say, and it's funny. I have to tell you, this is going to be a funny documentary. This is not going to be, it might be dark humor from time to time, but it's not going to be a documentary that's going to be sensationalizing. And it's not going to be one that over dramatizes or just creates the horror. We need to laugh about some of this. And because we've got kids in this, and we've got some adults that will say the funniest things too, it's going to be a look at ourselves and see, how are we able to break through from this in some ways? We've got kids that will talk about how they have been bullied, for example, but then in the next breath, they also recognize that they themselves might be bullying others, but they may not be conscious of it.
Right.
And that's an important lesson too, to really go, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I should have said something different. And to know that sometimes we say something without even thinking about it. I'm guilty of that. I have to tell you, I'm so guilty of sometimes I'll just blurt things out, and then I have to retract and go, I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking. I said the wrong thing. It's not exactly what I meant. It came across the wrong way. I think we're all guilty of that.
Oh,
or
yes,
guilty. We all do it.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we've all done it. It's just part of being human. But to be able to recognize, oh, I didn't mean to say that, and apologize and be aware of ourselves, having self-awareness, that's so important. And we're losing a lot of that on social media because there's so much anonymity. People are hiding behind a device. So you have in many cases, you have no idea who's attacking you. And people really, they can be just vile on social media. It's like they've got their talons out. They would never do this in person.
For sure. We're seeing far too much of that. And, and every time that there's something new that comes up, like now we've just had the Olympics and we've seen people be criticized for the clothes that they're wearing. And I'm listening to it and seeing it and I'm going, do we realize that these are people who worked very, very, very hard to get to the top level of the world, and they're being cut down because of a piece of clothing? What are we doing?
Very shallow, very shallow.
Very, very shallow. But it's got to be extremely hurtful.
Yeah.
I look at what's going on in social media and how people are cutting each other down, and they've got memes that are vile in some cases. And I'm going, why are you posting those things? It goes back to that idea of respecting conversation. If we start just a little bit and say, I'm curious about why you would post that, or is there a different way of looking at it? I don't believe that it's exactly the way that you believe it. Maybe I have a different perspective. Would you like to hear it? That's where we need to be starting, I think, because it's so easy to go down that dark tunnel, and none of us want to go down that dark tunnel. I think it's too difficult to get back.
I totally agree. And, I think one of the reasons that people don't want to hear other people's perspectives, it's because of fear, which was no different than the witch trials. That was fear-based.
Absolutely.
Fear is one of the worst things that people can fall into, and it does not bring out the best in humanity.
No, it doesn't. And I think to that point, a lot of people are trying to almost prove themselves that I am more of something than you are. And I'm more of, wherever you happen to fall on the political spectrum, that I'm more of this than you are. I'm more of that than you are, or whatever it might be. I'm better, or I belong in this group, and I'm terrified of being a part of another group that my friends and family or whomever might not appreciate or like. And then
Sure.
we start throwing ideas around, and accusations start flying around, and then it takes off. And to your point, social media is a big culprit, and the social media happens in just a couple of seconds, and then it's gone. Then it's not, or it's not gone. It takes off. It flares up,
Oh, yeah.
and it becomes that much more difficult to contain it. We've
It's
had experiences with that on this project as well, because we do a lot of social media. It's a great way for us to reach out and build our connections. And we've had people who have said strange things to us, and we have to be on top of it all the time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because it can grow very quickly and the story can change in a direction you don't want. And it can be totally wrong. And it was started because someone was being malevolent and just wanted
Exactly.
to undermine what you're doing. And you have done some tremendous work. You've co-produced Image Makers, the story of America's pioneer cinematographers for TCM, and a narrative short film, Dr. Penelope. That's winning awards and hearts around the world from what I see. Those are just a couple of them. So you've got those productions on
I
the festival
do.
circuit. You've done so many things. So I can't wait. And I'm sure all of our listeners are going to want to see this new documentary.
Thank you. No, I do have some exciting, wonderful projects behind me, and looking forward to even more. Well, I have made some wonderful projects and documentaries and narrative films alike. And I've also had the opportunity to mentor other people, especially women who are wonderful storytellers and who want to get out there and get their stories told, which I believe we need to see much more of.
I
But
totally agree.
but I feel so privileged to be in this world, to be able to tell these stories and to encourage people to think and to laugh and have a good time, you know?
And films are a wonderful way to do that.
Films connect.
Yeah, they really
Films
do.
connect.
Mhm. And this is something that can be watched for many generations.
That's the intent. That's the
Mhm.
goal of this particular film. One of the many reasons for why I wanted to tell this particular story. Elizabeth's story has already spread all around the world. And that's one reason for why I want to tell it, because it's a universal story. It's something that we can relate to no matter where we are, who we are. It's a story that I believe needs to be told. And it's a story that I believe is one for the generations, that's going to be seen in many versions. I would even say that there will probably, in my world, there will be the theatrical version, there will be a streaming version, there will be a version that will be partnering with some of the museums. For example, the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, that is one of our colleagues or one of our partners, to be able to show them to the general public, but also to show to schools. And so there may be a different version, a shorter version, because a feature-length film or even a series is not something that generally fits in with the curriculum, but we may be able to create some smaller versions of this that can be used in education for a long time to come. So I believe that this is a story that needs to be told now, but also that will continue to feel relevant moving forward.
I love this. When do you anticipate? You said 2026. You're hoping that it will actually be released. Now, will this be in theaters?
Well, the plan is to start with a film festival, and then we'll see. We don't have distribution for it yet. I'm holding on to it as far as creating the story before I'm selling it to anybody, in part because it's a very sensitive story and it's a precious story, and I want to make sure that we tell it right. So we don't know exactly the details of the when. We are currently funding the film. We're still funding the film through something called fiscal sponsorship, and our fiscal sponsor is Creative Visions. This is a nonprofit partner that can allow people or help people who want to participate at a larger level get tax deductions for some of their contributions. So we then receive those funds as a grant, And we report back to Creative Visions how those funds are being used so that there's constant communication and constant oversight with what we're doing and our contributors that are participating. So we are still funding and looking forward to getting that up and running this fall again. We've raised a little over half by now, which is a lot to create a film like this. And I'm convinced that we're going to get the rest of it as well, because this is something that I know people want to be a part of. And I know that they want to be able to follow the finishing journey of the story, and they want to finish the rest of the journey of the story as it goes into release and feel like they've got ownership of it, because that's the thing that happens when you're part of this, is you feel like you've got ownership. This is not just somebody else's story. This is my story. So I'm hopeful that we're going to get a lot of continued support for that.
Well, I certainly hope you do too. And that's why I wanted to feature you, definitely. And would you like people to reach out to you if they're interested in being involved, or if they could possibly provide more financial assistance? Because certainly that's always a consideration.
Absolutely, it is. And I have to say, too, for everyone out there, it's like, it doesn't matter if we get the $5 or we get the $500,000, although we do need the $500,000. But everybody that can contribute, big or small, is a part of this project. So let me say that as a starting point. But to get in touch with me and the rest of my team, the best thing to do is to go to thelastwitchfilm.com, and you can get in touch with us there, and to follow us on all social media. You can get in touch with us through social media as well. We are The Last Witch Film everywhere, so it's easy to remember, but that's the easiest way to get in touch with me.
I am so glad we talked about this. I had not really, until we had this conversation, thought about how current the Salem witch trials truly are, in a scary way. And people need to think about that. A lot of the same behavior is being exhibited, and human beings need to stop that. Persecution, marginalization, all of that. This documentary is going to spark a lot of debate, a lot of thought, hopefully some very positive change.
That's the hope. That's what I'm anticipating. So I go beyond the hope. That's the intent, and the goal is to create a documentary that's like that, but also that people have fun when they're watching it. So I want people to watch this and have fun, and then at the same time walk out of there and go, what did I just see, and what do I need to think about, and have a conversation with the people that they just saw it with, and have a conversation with other people to encourage them to see it. And like you said, really think about how we are showing up in the world. How are we showing up in the world? How are we interacting with each other? And do we like what we're seeing? And if not, how do we change it in a way that's positive for everybody involved? Because we can do that. If those kids can do it, we can do that.
I love this. Thank you so much for being on the show and sharing this story with us. And I wish you luck, and definitely please keep in touch. We want to know when you have this finished so everyone can watch it.
Will do. Thank you so much, Shelley. And I will say, really, if you keep following us on social media and follow us on our newsletters and such, we do share little snippets every now and then if you want to just see a little bit of what we're up to. So I would encourage everybody to just join us. We love the support. We love having you all along. And thank you so much, Shelley, for having me on this. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. Vice versa. We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode. And if you want to hear more episodes of Women Road Warriors or learn more about our show, be sure to check out womenroadwarriors.com. And please follow us on social media. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. On our website, we also have a selection of podcasts just for women. They're a series of podcasts from different podcasters. So if you're in the mood for women's podcasts, just click the Power Network tab on womenroadwarriors.com. You'll have a variety of shows to listen to anytime you want to. Podcasts made for women. Women Road Warriors is on all the major podcast channels like Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, YouTube, and others. So check us out, and please follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Women Road Warriors with Shelley Johnson and Kathy Tuccaro. If you want to be a guest on the show, or have a topic or feedback, email us at sjohnson@womenroadwarriors.com.